Hi, I'm Christina Chia. I am the Associate Director at the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke University, and I'm here to give you a quick introduction to our event, Digital and Public Durham History, Works in Progress at Duke and NCCU. And let me start by letting you know that this is actually a re-recording of the introduction. We had a bit of problem with the audio of the original version, so I'm just redoing this here. And if you're really observant, you'll see that my hair is actually of a different length than the rest of the video. So let me go ahead and give you, what I'll do is give you a bit of the immediate context of this event and also peel back in time a bit to tell you a little bit about a longer history of collaboration. So I'm going to quickly share a few slides with you. Okay, so starting, in the present, I want to let you know that this event is brought to you by the Digital Humanities Initiative at the Franklin Humanities Institute, the DHI FHI, which is directed by Dr. Victoria Szabo, and she'll be saying a few words about the DHI after I'm done here. And we also want to acknowledge our co-sponsors. Here at Duke, the Digital Art History and Visual Culture Lab, formerly known as the Wired Lab, and of course the FHI itself, with the support of our faculty director, Ranjana Khanna. At North Carolina Central University, we want to thank the College of Arts, Social Sciences, and the Humanities, and again, with special acknowledgement of Dean Carlton Wilson for his support over the years. So for the last 5 years or so, and with Mellon Foundation support for the first half of that period, the DHI at FHI has been home to the NCCU-Duke Digital Humanities Fellowships, a program that promotes digital pedagogy at NCCU and supports NCCU faculty in their research and professional development. The program has hosted 23 fellows to date. You see 7 of them here. And actually most of the fellows were able to join us back in March for a kind of reunion event in which some fellows shared their works in progress, and it was just really overall kind of lovely and inspiring occasion. So the link that you see here that I'm showing you now, when we put out this video, we will include that link along with other resources that will be mentioned in the rest of the talks today, and we'll put that all in a supplemental document to go with this video. So you'll have a chance to peruse all that at your own leisure. So, but going back to the Fellows Program a bit, of course, while we're incredibly proud of this program, we know that it did not invent the wheel. And in fact, the program was built on a longer history of collaborations with NCCU here at the FHI, as well as at Duke at large. And here I want to show you kind of just the top half of or not even half, a top sort of 10th of a timeline that Andre Van, the coordinator of University Archives at NCCU and one of our speakers, generously created and shared with me. This timeline documents research, teaching, and other collaborations between our 2 schools since the early 20th century, particular emphasis on the last 30 years or so. I also contributed a few entries that about projects that I know a little bit more of. You can see the full timeline again at that link, and again it's going to be in the supplemental document. But while we're here together, I do want to highlight a few things that I think are particularly of note. So, for example, the Behind the Veil oral history project from the 1990s, documenting life under Jim Crow, and several joint NCCU and Duke courses, including one co-taught by, again, Andre Van. Summer undergrad communications internship program directed by Charmaine McKissick Melton, Dr. Mack, and one of our DH fellows, and other projects that have emerged from the DH Fellows program, including a summer DH exchange for early career faculty from Pakistan, as well as a Story Plus project non-traditional students at HBCUs. And then finally, a brand new partnership between the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity and NCCU historians and archivists on the impact of COVID on Black businesses in Durham. And that's ongoing and again, brand new. But here at the FHI, the touchstone of our work with Central and with HBCUs has been our namesake, John Hope Franklin, whose extraordinary career spanned Duke and NCCU and spanned HBCUs and PWI's predominantly white universities. And I want to share with you one of my favorite photos from the FHI. This was, I think, from either October, November 2008, taken after Dr. Franklin has had lunch with the first cohort of HBCU residential fellows that we hosted at the FHI, and also with the late Srinivas Aravamudan, who was our faculty director at the time. So this was one of Dr. Franklin's last official engagements at the FHI. He passed a few months later in March 2009. We didn't have a central faculty in that particular cohort, but did the year after. So that's a snapshot of the Duke NCCU part of the title of this event. And the main part, Durham, public history, digital history, I will leave to our wonderful lineup of speakers. And even with this already full lineup, we recognize that there are many others, historians, genealogists, longtime residents of Durham with stories to tell, other folks who could have been at this event as well. But again, we wanted to focus on NCCU and Duke researchers simply because of the context that I've been sketching out here. And so with that, we segue back to the original recording of this event with Victoria Szabo telling us a bit about the DH initiative at FHI.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for that wonderful introduction to the event. And I just want to acknowledge Chris as being a huge motive force in all of this work over the years. She's really made it possible and kept things going on an intellectual level, administrative level, academic level. So I salute you, Chris. The NCCU-Duke Digital Humanities Fellows Program, which I've been honored to co-coordinate with Chris and other colleagues at Duke and at NCCU, is part of a larger Digital Humanities Initiative sponsored by the FHI. DHI at FHI includes a long-running PhD lab in digital knowledge for graduate students and supports events, projects, digital course interventions, and various partnerships, including with the Computational Media Arts and Cultures PhD program and a recent NEH Institute on virtual and augmented reality for the digital humanities. We also coordinate with the libraries and other campus entities like TTS and OIT, and with our co-sponsor, the past Wired Lab for Digital Art History and Visual Culture, now known as the DRL, in developing DH at Duke. Our concept of DH in FHI and beyond is capacious and transformative. As you can see in our logo with DH+, yes, we did the plus before everybody did it, references this critical DH idea, DH plus media, cultural, ethnic technology studies, minimalist computing, engaged work, pedagogy, community connections, all of these make a difference and help to mark what DH is here at Duke. We also supported Jesus Ruiz as a critical DH ACLS Emerging Voices postdoc this year, and continue to think about Duke DH as both global and local. And with this event, we hope to look for points of connection and opportunities for future development and collaboration across our institutions and across the city, and with its people, history, and cultural and built environments. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Vic. And I just want to now just take care of a few sort of housekeeping matters. I want to go over the schedule really, really quickly, just to let you know we have 2 rounds of lightning talks. The talks are 5 minutes each, and Jennifer Zhao from the FHI will be our timekeeper. Jennifer will have a buzzer at the 4 minute, 30 seconds, not 30 minutes mark, and then also one at the 5 minute mark. I don't know if Jennifer can buzz, let us hear the sound so you're not alarmed, but you could just imagine that. And then we'll have one very brief break in between and response and discussion. And then also because we have so little time today, for everyone who might be interested in staying behind and kind of maybe like mingling digitally, will be available for, maybe 15-20 minutes afterwards, and we can maybe just exchange emails or whatever there. And I also wanted to say, that unfortunately, Dr. Charles Johnson, Director of Public History at NCCU, will not be able to join us because of a death in the family. He wrote me sort of late last night and sent a pre-recorded video and a slideshow. So we'll do that. We'll run those at the, and he was scheduled to go last anyways before the response. So we'll do that at his slot. And a couple of Zoom housekeeping matters. So if you're in the audience, you're not presenting today, if you would please, we'd appreciate it if you obviously mute yourself, but also turn off your video. And then, feel free to put in questions in the chat as they occur to you. We may not get to all of them, obviously, but we'll be sure to share with the speakers. We're recording this and we'll have the chat transcript as well. And I'm going to, in a second, pop in a Google Doc with more information about the talks and including links to project sites and so forth. And we'll try to be good about popping in those specific links as the talks as we're going through the talks as well. Okay, I think that's everything. Just a quick reminder to the speakers that because of the limitation of time, we'll ask you to briefly introduce yourselves. So I think that's actually it, and we're almost right on time. Okay, so what we'll do is that I will kind of call each speaker up to the podium, as it were, and Jennifer will keep time, but if you could kind of introduce yourselves a little bit more fully, that would be great. Okay. Okay, then let's see. Okay, so I'm going to also put this link in here so everyone can see. This is the link to the published program with the order of presentation. And here's the link I promised that has more info about each talk. Okay, all right, so I guess we'll start then with Dan Richter. Dan.
Wow. Every once in a while, each of us gets put in a special position to lead off. So I never used to lead off in baseball, but I really appreciate this meeting. I'm a longtime Durham resident, moved here in '77, and have always loved the place. Let's see if I can blow that, expand that, and we'll begin. So Chris asked me to talk about my ongoing study of soil lead concentration in Durham, and I get to talk twice, so I'm a pinch hitter. It's great to meet you all. I'm a soil chemist. I work on the Duke Forest. Two of my colleagues who Chris tried to recruit to talk about the Duke Forest, Sarah Childs, who's the current director of the Duke Forest, and my close colleague, Nikki Cagle, who's a lecturer in environmental science and policy, had other activities, important activities for today. So I get to stand in and lead off. So I'm going to talk about the Duke Forest as a, quote, time machine, and I'll explain where we're going in a moment with the time machine. There are two core Duke Forest objectives that the university holds near and dear. There are two other objectives that I'm going to maintain are just as important and are very much growing in importance. But let's just start with a little description of the incredible thing we have here in our community, the Duke Forest, and the two formal objectives, which have stood the test of time since the 1930s. It's almost 100 years old. But the first of these is education. And here's just a random activity on the Duke Forest. One of the Duke Forest supervisors, Tom Craven, is showing us how to plant trees. You know, such a mundane thing, but if you didn't plant a tree 20 years ago, plant one today. It's kind of an incredible thing. that education has gone on for a century on the Duke Forest, mainly surrounding forestry activities. The second core objective that has worked out very successfully over time is research and science. And it's quite a narrowly defined, historically narrowly defined forest ecology, forest research. And one of the jewels of the Duke Forest, research-wise, are hundreds of permanent forest plots that are periodically remeasured, as is illustrated in the photo on the bottom left. Hundreds of forest plots. So we look at organisms in the forest and how they change through time. And that's part of this time machine. It's an incredibly dynamic place, the Duke Forest. Two other examples, just to define the education, nearly 90 classes of forestry master's students have graduated, including Zakiya Holmes Leggett, who I got the distinct privilege of being her advisor. You can see she's a Tuskegee grad, but she graduated from Duke as an MF. She's now a professor of forestry, very successful at NC State. She's one of many examples. I wish we had more African Americans, but we can always work on that for sure. The second example is research. And I mentioned the jewels, which are the permanent plots, but here's an incredible research project where for 15 years we studied how CO2, which is increasing in the atmosphere that we all breathe and that exists throughout the world, how that extra CO2 in the atmosphere is stimulating forest photosynthesis. And here we had this incredible study that went through the 80s and early 2000s. These are 100-foot diameter plots, and they are without a chamber. And the only difference within that plot of those forests is what's added to the atmosphere here from these little poles. So CO2 is pumped into these. And it was basically a study of how forests would grow in 2050. It was one of maybe 3 worldwide experiments like that. But the other two objectives that aren't formal, that I think are more and more important through time over the decades and have great future potential, are how the Duke Forest and the city relates to each other. And so I say here, there's great potential, even though there's great participation by many members of the Durham City and Durham County and surrounding communities. There's so much more that could be done here. And whether that's recreation by walking and biking on the left, or taking advantage of facilities like on the right, the Ross Picnic Shelter. Yes, for a fee, but recreation walking is for free. But the other one is Duke Environmental History, and this is more on the intellectual side of things, but the field of environmental history began in the 1980s, according to environmental historians. The core story of environmental history began in the 1980s. And it began at Duke too. There were historians here that studied environmental history and really started to put it on the disciplinary map. And Duke Forest was a part of that, a very important part of that. But I think that environmental history has made the Duke Forest a far more interesting place, both as we learn about humans and nature relations, how we've lived on the land. All of us have lived on the land, and how we've left our legacies behind, and how we can study that. And then it's also a far more interesting place, that is the Duke Forest, to learn about an expanded definition of public history. I mean, it's all of us have lived on the land, and the Duke Forest is a special place. It's not always been a forest. In fact, in the 1930s, it was largely farmland. And most of the Duke Forest are old farms where we can look and see and study where people have lived and how they lived over time. both with nature and amongst us all. So that's all I have. It's a lightning talk, Chris. Thanks very much for listening.
Right. No, thanks, Dan. Okay, so and I just wanted to, yeah, no, thanks, Dan. I know that was a very little time, and just quickly, that image that you were showing at the end is of a grave site in the woods, and you know, there's and you can speak more to this, but that there, you know, the farms that are, you know, small farms and mills that are on the side of the Duke Forest. And there are, you know, grave sites of enslaved people as well as white settlers. And it's a very rich history that there's a working group now called Unearthing Duke Forest, just trying to bring to light. Okay, and Dan's part of it and has led a number of tours of the sites for us. Okay, then, so let me now move to our next speaker, who will be, speaking of grave sites, Kaylee Alexander.
Okay, so I'm Kaylee Alexander. I'm a recently minted PhD from the Art History and Visual Studies Department at Duke, where I focused on funerary monuments and cemeteries in 19th century Paris, but more recently I've been working a lot with the researchers over at Geer Cemetery, which is Durham's first public African-American cemetery in Durham. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So for those of you who are unaware, Geer Cemetery, again, is Durham's first public African-American cemetery. It was founded in 1877, when the land was purchased from the Geer family by John O'Donnell, Nelson Mitchell, and Willie Moore to serve as a burial ground for Durham's Black community, who at that time did not have a public space to bury their dead. But since the 1940s, the cemetery has been in a relative state of abandonment. So many of the tombstones are missing, heavily damaged. And we also don't have any sort of administrative document that comprehensively lists everyone who's buried there. So it's been very difficult to sort of track, you know, ancestors of many Durhamites and any, you know, people around the East Coast as well. So the Friends of Geer Cemetery formed in 2003. They were a grassroots effort to preserve and reclaim the cemetery, and working off of various forms of available evidence. One of their main tasks has really been to research those buried there and to engage in descendant outreach. So until this year, they had a running list of about 1,500 names and folders on Google Drive containing all sorts of documents, from census records to death certificates, that volunteers had amassed over the last couple of decades. I came onto this project relatively late, so I joined last fall while they were finalizing their plans for the exhibition In Plain Sight, which took place in the cemetery from January to April of this year, and was intended partially to showcase the relationships between those buried in Geer and the history of Durham as a city. So seeing the death certificates on their web system, I immediately saw an opportunity to create a database that we could use both to analyze general trends among Durham's Black community during the era of Jim Crow, but also to provide a useful resource for descendants and researchers moving forward. And this was really a way to incorporate the skills I had employed for studying Paris in my dissertation to a project that was a little bit closer to home and could hopefully serve a larger community. So after using the Friends of Geer's running list of names, I was able to figure out a way to scrape all of the death certificate data from Family Search. And then we worked with a team of other volunteers, chiefly Nick Levy, Carissa Trotta, and Tim Foley, to fill in as many of the blanks as possible, because Family Search didn't transcribe everything from the death certificates, but we really wanted to fill in things like the cause of death, attending doctors, undertakers, and other important details manually that would really flesh out our story of the Durham community. And to date, we have about 1,800 records for individuals, but this data is heavily skewed towards the period after 1909 because death certificates weren't available for Durham prior to that date. But we still wanted to use this timeline that starts in 1877 because we wanted to not only show all this great information that we had amassed, but draw clear attention to the fact that there was still so much that we didn't know. And I just want to say here that I really find data visualizations to be powerful tools to also display what we don't know as equally as what we do. So we did look at pretty broad trends such as occupational frequency, major causes of death, and infant mortality rates, but we also wanted to stress the human aspect of this because, of course, people are not just statistics, they're individuals with important and relevant lives to Durham's history. So this example here that I'm showing is a visualization I put together on Tableau, and it shows every person that we know to have been buried in gear plotted by their age at death and the year that they died. And again, we can see that there's very little data prior to 1909, and things become less frequent also after the 30s. And this is when Beechwood Cemetery becomes fully operational. That was intended to be the African-American counterpart to Maplewood Cemetery under Separate but Equal. In the interactive version online that I'll drop the link to in the chat, you can hover over each box and get the individual's name, life dates, occupation, and other important details from the death certificates. Beyond this exhibition and the aggregate analysis of how the cemetery's residents could be used to understand general trends about Durham's Black community in the first half of the 20th century, we really wanted to make these data available to the public in a useful way. So I've also been working on a searchable database in Tableau that's going to be embedded in the Friends of Gear's new website, which should be coming out in the next couple of weeks, hopefully. And here I'm showing a screenshot of our beta version of the database where you can search for the last name or the first name of an individual, click on the name and get this little pop-up with really basic information. It's not everything that we have, but it gives you a general idea of what we do have as a place to start from. And so, what we wanted to stress with this is that we can tell an aggregate history using data, but, there's an ethical aspect of this too. We can't just lump people together and call it a day. We have to really hone in on these case studies and individual stories. So this database will be available on the website, but another important component of that will be these life stories that our genealogists have been working on over the years, and some oral histories and other media as well. So that's all I can offer you for this moment, but we'll talk more.
Thanks so much, Kaylee. Okay, so let me move on to the next speaker. Thanks so much again. And our next speaker is Andre Van.
First of all, let me say good morning to everyone. Thank you, of course, Christina, for the great opportunity to sort of share with you a little bit of research I've sort of focused on. And if you give me one moment, I'm going to hold on 1 second. I'm going to put it up. Just 1 second. All right. Hope everyone can see that. So, as I've entitled it, first of all, can everyone see it? I hope so. The upbuilding of Hayti and Black Wall Street movements and memory. And so this is sort of, well, first, I have been a resident here in Durham since I came to North Carolina Central University as a freshman in 1988. Undergraduate work there, went to over North Carolina State and got my public history. UNC Chapel Hill as certified university manager, and also have detailed the history of African-American life here in 2 works, Durham's Hayti and Images of America as well, African Americans of Durham County, which sort of trace the history, growth, and development. And so I've had a chance to sort of see some of this history that's being presented here today, and also work and help to record some of it. But so the premise of this talk sort of looks at the idea of looking at Hayti and looking at Black Wall Street through the lens of historical memory that is used by individuals, as well as through these historical moments and currents that have occurred. And so I'll start with this premise, rethinking how we see history and writing others into history. And that's a very powerful moment as well. Hold 1 second. And so my guiding thought is by Keith McMenemy that states that historians sometimes have to compile evidence themselves, filling in the gaps by venturing to go after the evidence. And so that's so very true in terms of looking at this research. But a few guiding thoughts to keep in mind. One that, as noted here, movements and memory are both important, and how we remember these moments has a great deal of matter as well. For those here in Durham, when you look at the era of the Jim Crow era, the Civil Rights Movement, and certainly urban renewal, these come with bits and pieces of history that oftentimes can be seen and viewed as painful pieces of history for African-American life here in Durham. But it's also equally important to understand that each and every little city, town, and hamlet has some form of history, good or bad, whether they want to admit it or not. And so Durham operates around the narrative of this model of race relations. And so that there are tests to it in terms of some of the actions and decisions. As we know, history is about the decisions that men and women make in the city. And so, but also the focus on digital application of history always, in my opinion, should be community-centered. And most importantly, something that is not discussed, intergenerational in scope, in terms of making sure that the next generation is equally aware of this history as well. And also, sometimes we understand that sometimes historical record is incomplete. And there are some things sometimes in which we may not know at present, but may be revealed at a later date. So I sort of looked at Hayti and Black Wall Street and have been researching for a project looking at COVID-19 and its impact upon the Black businesses here in Durham. And so for me, the idea is understanding two key terms, group economics and group politics, and how they function and how they flow. But you had to keep in mind the idea that a majority of African Americans reside in the South in the early 20th century. They use the idea of pooling their resources, operating under group economics as a way. And so examples of that, Mechanics and Farmers Bank, North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, Mutual Savings and Loan helped to put Durham in the memory of not just those here in Durham, but all throughout the country as this model for economic advancement. But also the question of uplift and self-determination, I think are important indicators in terms of looking at this work. And as a result, interestingly, of the segregation, you were able to find these vibrant communities of African Americans that were sustainable during the midst of segregation and somewhat post-desegregation, and then there are challenges to that that fray after. But also understanding that that when we center these African American communities, you have to look at examples, and there are plenty of examples here in Durham of that work. Looking at Hayti, Hickstown, Walltown, East End, and the Bottoms are examples of some of that research along the way, I think, that will yield a lot of dividends and work. The question of memory, that is individual, corporate, and community memory are important as a result of that sense of collective memory. And so you have to sort of work to sort of test all of these memories based on the evidence that we come across. But it's important to record this memory because sometimes it provides what the books and narratives may not. But also it's important to understand the idea of looking at the question of when we talk about Durham and Black Wall Street, as I say, a redefinition of the world of work here in Durham. And not just that was not just centered on Black Wall Street and Paris Street, but also looked at other vocations that many have sort of failed to sort of focus on. And I sort of focus on African American funeral homes in Durham, by the way, as a model and way to sort of get there. But again, I note that when we talk about the history and these distinct communities that are existing, that's important to understand that that Durham, again, modeled itself as its model race relations, but was highly segregated. And African American businesses flourished and flowed as a result of that, creating two distinct communities and two distinct economies, all coexisting at the same time in the same place. And lastly, my point there that people take comfort from the past due to anxiety of the present. And so that's important to understand. So my concluding thoughts as I get towards my 5 minutes is that we have to reconsider this idea of historical history and memory, and then create a much more broader conversation by looking at not just the executives on Black Wall Street, but also looking at beauty salons, barbershop, funeral home, realtors, restaurants, and these single owner businesses as a way of understanding this. Also move away from this idea of one singular narrative because Durham is a much more broader place with much more diverse histories and stories that need to be told. And so when you add that lens, you add in the inclusion of women and marginalized communities, and certainly also community histories as well. And lastly, keep in mind that when we talk about the question of Durham, it has always been about self-image and self-representation. And if you remember nothing else about Durham, it is that these two things have clearly defined the African American community in Durham. And lastly, the most important question that I had to consider when looking at COVID-19 1 year back, along with the question of racial unrest, is that it also asks us to look at the question and the future of work relative to these minority-centered businesses. And so that, I think, hopefully gives you a sort of glimpse into some of the latest work that we're kind of working on to sort of help tell these stories that need telling. And so I'm thankful for that opportunity.
Thank you so much. Thanks for these framing thoughts. This is really useful, and I hope that we'll have a chance to discuss this towards the end as well. Andre will also be giving a response after we go through all the talks. So I'm going to move to the next speaker, which is Tony Frazier, one of our alum from our fellows program.
Chris, I just hit share screen so everybody can see it. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tony Frazier. I'm assistant professor in history in the history department, and I'm also a graduate of North Carolina Central University. So many years ago, well, not that many, but a few years ago, as I was a Duke fellow, as Chris noted, a colleague of mine, Dr. Jarvis Hargrove, we both started talking about Dr. Shepard and wanted to think about him in different ways. And one of the things we came up with was to look at him, look at his travels, particularly from 1895 to 1947. So today, this is just a real rough draft of a story map, but I wanted you all to be able to see some of the things that I'm thinking about as we move through this. So I love this picture of Dr. Shepard here. But the main research objective was to explore Dr. Shepard as a local, national, and international figure. And one way to do that is through a digital story map using ArcGIS and using geography to look at his early travels, not only before founding the institution of North Carolina Central University, but travels he had before that and travels he had as he opened the school to raise money all over the country, and looking at the locations. And the future goal is to be able to pinpoint the exact churches where he spoke at, his speeches, and other important sites of his travel. So today I get to be much more interactive than I was a few weeks ago. So, and I'm happy for that as well. Let me bring you all back up here. Okay. So I want to be more interactive today. Okay. So in the purple, I built layers for different time periods. So I built layers for 1894 to 1905, built layers for the 1907 trip to Rome, and also the global trip that he took in 1907. In 1912, I didn't bring all the layers with me today, so I'm just going to talk about a few things here. But in the purple, you can also, the good thing about ArcGIS, you can move the map around. If you were using this, you would be able to move it around as well. But let's just take a look at some of the purple. Click here. Okay, so this is from 1900. This is the first meeting of the National Negro Business League. Dr. Shepard spoke at this meeting with Booker T. Washington. And the more you do research, you also discover that many people consider Dr. Shepard as also a founder of the National Negro Business League. So this is in 1900 in Boston. This is Dr. Shepard in 1902 giving a speech at the Second Baptist Lyceum in Washington, D.C. Just moving with the purple. This is Dr. Shepard in Nashville as a representative of the International Sunday School Union. He moved to Virginia here in 1894 to work as a pharmacist. So in each location, the goal is to have pictures, to have information about what took place in specific cities. Here, in 1898, in the Facts and Stories, Dr. Shepard left Washington, D.C. to begin appointment to International Revenue Service in Raleigh, appointed by President McKinley. So you see with the, in the purple with the 1894 to 1905, you're getting a viewpoint of his life at that time period. The next layer, as I shift the map over, is his 1907 trip that he ended up in Rome for the International Sunday School Association meeting. But before he arrived in Rome, he took what was a global trip, and he left Durham in that time period in February 1907 to go on this, what I would call a global tour throughout Asia and Africa and Europe. And you can see some of the locations that Dr. Shepard traveled all throughout Egypt, all throughout what today we refer to as the Middle East. And you can see a line here as he travels all through Greece, into Italy, arrives in Rome for the International Union, where he was the only African-American speaker on the rostrum at that time. His travels through Italy, France, and even to the United Kingdom. In the red, you get an idea of his 1912 travels, and you can see he's all throughout the Midwest, and at this time he's raising money for the institution. You see him in Chicago, you see him in Wyoming, speaking to the Buffalo Soldiers. You see him in Los Angeles, where he spoke at numerous churches in Los Angeles in 1912. So the goal is, as I said once before, when you click on this, you will be able to see his travels. And I want to switch one moment here. I hope I don't run out of time. Let's see here. The end product, the future goal is to have this map look something similar to this, whereby if you click on a location or you click on a name, it'll take you to the location. It'll be a much more larger picture, a much more larger story. So my vision is for the project to look similar to this, not an exact replica, but the idea is that all these spaces and locations would have a story map component to the right of it, and include music and other things. So this is a much larger project than I'm able to show today, but this is the outcome and growth of how this project began and where it's heading. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Tony. I think it's really interesting to see, through the figure of Dr. Shepard, the connections between Duke between Durham and the world. Okay, so now, and this kind of harkens back, I think, a little bit to what Andre was talking about. We now have Sarah Heilman and Amiya Mehrotra, who's going to present on the Pauli Murray Center Civil Rights Map.
Yes, I'll share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. All right. So hello, everyone. Welcome to Mapping Historic Protests and Community Action in Durham, NC, presented by the Pauli Murray Center. My name is Sarah. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a third-year Duke student studying public policy, environmental policy, and Spanish. I've been working with the Pauli Murray Center since October of last year, and it's been a really wonderful way to get to know Durham more. So I'm excited to be here with you all today.
My name is Amiya, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a first-year student at Duke who's interested in studying history and public policy. Like Sarah, I've been working with the Pauli Murray Center since October of last year, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today.
So if you aren't already acquainted with the Pauli Murray Center, it is a project in Durham associated with civil rights activist, lawyer, educator, writer, and Episcopal priest Pauli Murray. Dr. Murray was raised in Durham, not very far from Duke's campus. The center, which is based out of her childhood home, is focused on addressing enduring inequities and injustices in the nation, and we're planning to open to the public soon. After this presentation, we really encourage you to do a quick Google search of Pauli Murray when you get the chance. And as student interns, our work at the center has mainly been focused on researching and curating markers for our civil rights map, which Amiya will tell you more about.
So the Civil Rights Map is a student-led initiative that officially began in the summer of 2020, but the research has been compiled since 2009 by over 75 Duke and UNC students and developed into nearly 100 map markers. Our work is focused on updating and expanding this map to meet the needs of a growing virtual audience and to be more relevant for families, teachers, students, residents, visitors, and others. We hope to cater to those who are interested in learning about the landscape of activism and community engagement in Durham and its connection to national social justice movements. On the slide, you will see a visual that illustrates our work plan and long-term goals. The research phase is ongoing, but we have now moved into the second phase. We're currently investigating numerous platforms and online delivery mechanisms to determine which may work best for our project. And ultimately, we hope to add these programs to the Pauli Murray Center website as a resource to be used both in Durham and nationally. These programs will complement the map that serves as our archive, which you can find at www.durhamcivilrightsmap.org. In addition to these online programs, we are also creating self-guided walking tours.
So to give you an idea of how the website actually works, this is a screenshot of the homepage of the Civil Rights Map. Kaylee Alexander actually created a really happy coincidence for us because the example marker we chose was for Gear Cemetery. You can see that we've created close to 100 markers, each one with a map marker in and around Durham. And when you click on a marker like this one, a pop-up window appears on the left with a brief description of the marker. And when you click read and hear more, you can read a more detailed description of the site, view multiple photos, and hear an audio version of the text for accessibility. We also have a search function, and markers are tagged by theme and date in order to make searching easier. But our current platform does have its limitations. Right now, it essentially functions as an archival home for all of the markers that we've researched and written, but it isn't the most intuitive and it doesn't allow us to group markers for a tour. Our team's next goal is to find a new and more user-friendly platform for our programs through which we can conduct virtual tours using GPS technology and also provide directions for self-guided in-person walking tours in Durham.
So as Sarah just mentioned, we've been working on a variety of virtual and self-guided tours across Durham. Right now, the newest tours that we are working on are centered around African-American activism, civil rights leadership, LGBTQ+ activism, and Latinx activism. These tours are intended to showcase different strategies of protest, highlight diverse social justice efforts, and emphasize the multifaceted nature of activism in Durham. We're excited for classrooms and the general public to interact with these tours in the coming months and learn more about the role that community action and historical protests have played in making Durham the place that it is today.
So before we end, we both wanted to share what excites us most about the MAP project and why we feel that it's unique. For me, working on this project has really helped me rethink the space that I occupy as a student in Durham. I'm originally from the area, and working with the Pauli Murray Center has really encouraged me to challenge and recontextualize my assumptions about places in my community that I might write off as mundane at first glance.
So I'm excited about this project because as a history major, I've realized the depth of intersectional history that's often omitted from school curriculums. I like how this map uncovers and highlights Durham's history of social justice activism. And as Duke students, I feel like we should all be aware of the history of the spaces that we occupy. So I hope that this map can ultimately help educators incorporate this history into their curriculums. So lastly, we just wanted to say thank you. We really appreciate you all being here today, and we're so excited to hear about other historical projects in Durham. If anything we spoke about today interests you, or if you have any feedback at all, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at the email listed on the slide, which is info@paulymurraycenter.org. And thank you again.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so moving right along, and Dan, you're up for the lead legacy talk.
All righty. That last one was an interesting one. I especially want to connect with Sarah's comment that something like it's remarkable how some of the most exciting places are those that first appear mundane. I very much adhere to that. Yes, let me bring up a short lightning talk I want to call Making Visible the Invisible, the Legacy of Lead in Durham Soil. I had the great privilege of working with a very talented soil chemist, Anna Wade, who graduated from Duke in summer of 2020. She led a project in which we walked 26 miles of Durham's streets with a small class of eight or nine students. sampling soil in and out of all of our neighborhoods, all from east to west over that time period. We met a lot of people, had a lot of conversations, both in those neighborhoods and with city officials about our project. Much of the public health interest is in lead from paint. There's a number of scientists who think that legacy lead from gasoline is equally important. And so lead is a contaminant that comes from water supply, from the soil, from indoors, from outdoors. It's going to be a problem for many years to come. I might also say that from my point of view, as a soil chemist, there's very little information about city soil lead concentrations. There's a great deal that is known, vast amount that is known medically, toxicologically, public health wise. So we've found a niche for ourselves, and we thought we were going to construct the first city lead map in North Carolina, but more about that later. So a little bit of history about legacy lead in paint. Here's the additions to the United States environment of lead in paint. It was phased out by the 70s in fresh paint. Of course, that paint persists in houses that even exist today and that will exist in the future. The other big source of lead came from gasoline, which peaked in the 1970s here. And then fell off rapidly in the 80s. So we've been 40 or 50 years since most of the lead has been added to the environment. And so that's what we call legacy lead. The other thing that's happened over this 50-year period is from the medical environmental health side, and that's an amazing amount of new information that basically has arrived at a point where the CDC says there is no safe blood lead level, even though we use this 5 micrograms per deciliter limit. They also say so the first little exposure that one gets has the greatest effects. It's greatest adverse effects, I should say. So I guess I've made that point with this period here, but yeah, we're at a very interesting point in this lead contamination story. And my group of people who I work with think that we've entered a new stage in this horrible story. My revelation, my epiphany came when I looked at an amazing researcher, Howard Milkey, who has worked on this issue since the mid-'80s. He's at Tulane today. And here's his soil neighborhood lead concentration map of New Orleans. He's studied many cities, but he's focused on New Orleans. And the more red, the higher the concentration. And according to the EPA, 400 or 100 parts per million lead in soil will cause adverse effects, both behaviorally, cognitively. There is no reason for having lead in the human body, and that's a really amazing thing. Well, here's the revelation. Here's the soil lead map in New Orleans. Here is the blood lead map in New Orleans. It's the same neighborhoods. The correlation is not only uncanny, it is striking. So I'm going to go back and forth, and you can see it's basically a 1-to-1 correlation, blood, soil, blood. So anyway, as a soil chemist, when I saw this map, I knew I had to get into this work, and we started in Durham. And so a little bit more about our Durham study. Here's the different ways that we sampled what we call the historic core. My apologies to my NCCU colleagues who are just off this map, of course, but we went along East Duke Street all the way to Miami Boulevard, all the way downtown, Roxborough Street. These are streets we all know. Club Boulevard, 3 miles of Club Boulevard. What we're doing is we're sampling street side soil and to see if we can still detect legacy lead that's 50 years old. We also sampled houses throughout many neighborhoods. Those are in squares there. And we sampled 10 urban parks, 10 of the city parks. Here's some results. You can see that legacy lead, I should say that the geologic background concentration of lead is 10 to 30 parts per million. And so you can see that most of the street side soil samples are well above the geologic concentration that's naturally in soil. But on the other hand, we're also dealing with a lot of street side soils that are above the levels of concern that have been issued by EPA. And this is 50 years after lead was taken out of gas. And that's because lead as a chemical element is very insoluble. It does not dissolve in water like table salt. I want to show you a little map of East Campus that we did. We mapped East Campus to train students. What I'd like to do, here's the southeast lawn of East Campus. We'll go to it. And here's Buchanan Street and West Main, the intersection there. What we did was we took this device we have, an X-ray device, and we mapped this southeast campus lawn on East Campus very intensively. And here's the 3-dimensional map. And here you can still see the roadside elevated concentrations. They're highly variable now. It's 50 years since lead was in gasoline. But here across that lawn, here's the perspective in the arrow here. It's the same perspective as this arrow. As you're looking toward the Buchanan West Main Street corner, you can still see these are concentrations that are of concern. In any event, very revealing the invisible is what we can do here. Here's a summary of the map around houses that we got the IRB to approve us. And we sampled 2 kinds of soils at residential lawns over houses that span the age of housing in Durham. And here's the red lines of the 2 EPA issued guidance levels. And you can see that the older houses, especially around foundations, have incredibly high concentrations of lead in them today. And then that's within 3 feet of the house, those yellow dots. And then out in the yards, the concentrations are much less, fortunately. So what have we learned? What are we learning? Soils adjacent to older homes built prior to the 1970s, very high concentrations of lead near the house. We have now assembled 200 samples, so we know what we're talking about here. Street side soils also harbor legacy lead, but here it's from gasoline. And so we've got 400 samples across 26 miles of Durham streets. It's a first order study, but we're learning a lot fast. And finally, I leave you with an idea. We hypothesized that while city soil lead is actually decreasing over the decades as time goes by, soil is eroded, it's mixed, whether by little kids, unfortunately, or by just new power line poles being put up. Street side soil is undergoing a lot of mixing. And so no wonder our hypothesis is it's decreasing over time. But we think that decrease is leaving behind high soil lead in hot spots that may be predictable and it may represent a relatively small but important area of the city. And so we ask, maybe we're entering a new stage in terms of lead contamination, and maybe it's more of a remediable problem. Maybe we can move to a point in the next few years in which Durham and other similar cities, big and small, begin to address this problem. We think it's an important one and one that will last for decades. Thanks for your attention, colleagues.
Thanks so much, Dan. And I'd love to, maybe in the discussion period, also think about how these different maps sort of lay on top of each other in terms of neighborhoods and demographics and so forth. And I'm really glad that we have this sort of really interdisciplinary group of researchers to think about what historical layers might mean in our city. And we're now at the second round of lightning talks for digital and public Durham history, works in progress at Duke and NCCU. And again, I'm Chris Chia. I'm going to kind of call our speakers to the podium, and Jennifer is going to keep time with her special beeper. And then so I think we're just going to go ahead and start. And thanks for everyone who's presented, and we're looking forward to this next round. So our next pair of presenters, Trudy Abel and Victoria Szabo.
Hey, thank you for having us. So I'm Trudy Abel. I'm a cultural historian and archivist at the Rubenstein Library, and I'm gonna get us launched. So we're here to talk about Digital Durham. It's a project I began in 1999 as one of Duke's first digital humanities projects. The project received startup funding from the Center for Instructional Technology and later support from Trinity Arts and Sciences, Liberal Studies, and an NC ECHO grant. The initial CIT funding enabled me to hire a team of undergraduates to program the website and build the first data set, the 1880 census. And the idea was to build a resource for the whole Durham community that contained unique items from Duke's rare book and special collections library, like manuscript letters, photographs, printed materials, maps, and census data. These things that could help university faculty and area K-12 teachers integrate primary sources into their teaching of Durham's post-Civil War history, as well as explore broader themes of emancipation, industrialization, immigration, and urbanization in the context of the New South. Over the years, I have worked with DPS school teachers to do teacher training through grant funding. I also developed a research service learning seminar for Duke's Digital Durham students, where they worked with 8th graders at neighboring middle schools to develop their digital skills and interests in history at the same time. So Digital Durham continues to be supported by Trinity College, and we continue to draw upon it as a research and teaching resource. And at the moment, faculty from art history, visual studies, public policy, history, and education, and other fields use materials from Digital Durham in their teaching. We know too that K-12 teachers are a key audience for our work.
So I began working with Trudy on Digital Durham soon after I arrived at Duke in 2006. By 2011, we were co-teaching the second iteration of our version of the Digital Durham course, building upon the work Trudy and her students had done in the past. My role in the partnership was to think about how we could deploy new technologies for teaching and sharing the project content, and at the same time, to think about how to grow archivally driven digital humanities at Duke more broadly through critical engagement with new technologies and across various disciplines and media forms.
Over the years, we have now taught several iterations of the Digital Durham course, which is now cross-listed in history, education, and visual media studies. The course continues to draw upon the archive and other primary and secondary sources to explore the history of the city and its inhabitants in the postbellum South. In teaching, we explore the core themes of industrialization and the development of the manufacturing and tobacco industries, urbanization, the rise of the Black middle class, the subsequent, sometimes destructive waves of transformation of the city's fabric, and the role of Duke University and other institutes of education in the city. Throughout, we highlight race, class, and gender relations, especially as they manifest in education, politics, religion, and the built environment.
Students do both primary source historical research, including reading the work of Pauli Murray, among others, and create digital projects as part of the class. With the help of our students, we've created interactive maps, city tours, and mobile apps, and during our recent Vast Connections project, began developing new content for the website, which we plan to reskin, extend, and expand with new letters, etc., including letters from Richard Wright, integration of geo-rectified historic maps, ready for incorporation into new digital projects, more census and tax data, and additional primary source materials culled from the Rubenstein Library's existing collections.
And this leads us to our most recent project, the enrichment and digital recontextualization of the Charles N. Hunter scrapbook collection. The scrapbooks were collected by editor-educator Charles N. Hunter, who documented Black life and experience through his clippings that he took from Black and white press from the 1870s to the 1930s. Duke Libraries image these materials and offer them to users as a set of undifferentiated PDFs. They contain a wealth of tantalizing materials, and they're partially indexed. We hope to work with them to retrace these clippings.
And so I know we're out of time, so I'll just say our plan is to create a digital version of these enriched texts and make them available in the Turn the Books kind of exhibition, as well as for archival visitation and expansion. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And then moving on, we have Brad Chambers, who's another one of our former fellows from the NCCU-DH program.
I'm just trying to pull up my screen. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present Christina. And here we go. So, first of all, good morning still. And my name is Brett Chambers. I teach at North Carolina Central. I'm a former producer, executive producer, director with ABC, WTVD, and in Durham and KGO in San Francisco. Been at North Carolina Central for a number of years now, like 17. And I like to integrate all these wonderful technologies that keep popping up. And I'd like to start off by thanking the Franklin Humanities Center for supporting me when I had a chance to go to Silicon Valley 2 years ago. It's been almost exactly 2 years, Victoria. And what it's allowed me to do is bring a lot of this to the classroom for my students. And ergo, this is called the Durham Committee, Student Agency and Digital Storytelling. And what you see there are some of our students in class. When we first decided to go ahead and, the class actually had a vote in this. They had a chance to choose whether they would participate with an opportunity. Rick Leggett, I've known him and worked with him on other things outside of education, offered us an opportunity to participate in a project with the Durham Committee on the Affairs of Black People and their new 501c3 arm, nonprofit arm, the Inc. So the question was, how does the committee, which is an 85-year-old organization, how do they work with and attract the attention of younger folks? So the first thing we had to do was share history, and that's what you saw initially in the first slide, was the students were hearing from Rick, but also from some of the one of the outgoing chairman, Omar Beasley. So we had to share the history with the students first so they could understand what the motivation was, the why, if you will. So we wanted to engage students to tell the story of an 85-year-old organization. So some of their parents weren't even around yet. So we introduced the organization. Then we asked the students, how do we get your attention? And they strategized and came up with how they were going to go after assets. So thank you very much, Andre Van, for giving some of the students some perspective. They have these resources that they wanted to reach out to. And I'm gonna hit this just real quick, just about 15 seconds of this.
August 15th, 1935, Clinton Spaulding, James E. Shepard, Richard M. Harris, W.D. Hill, R.L. McDougall, J.T. Taylor, and L.E. Austin all came together at the Durham Tennis Club to discuss Black affairs. This meetup became the foundation to the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs.
So that was just the beginning, just a little clip from the video that they produced for the Durham Committee. And by the way, they got this at the beginning of, middle of January, because that's when we started, and they had to have it ready to present to the committee. And it's still a work in progress, but this is just one of the elements that they wanted to have done. And they had, this is them talking to, what happened here? That's them talking to Omar there. So we provided guidance and resources to execute their plan. In the end, our goals were very simple. We wanted to clarify what the role of the committee was and the Durham Committee Inc. was. And then we had to create some type of media projects for them, but the students were in charge of all of this from the beginning to the end. I guided them, shared some of the tools that we're going to use. They all had to get the Google News Initiative badges, the mobile device acquisition. We used a lot of mobile technology because of Zoom. Because of pandemic. Zoom is kind of identified with pandemic. But we used a lot of the Google tools to help them tell the story, but also to help them organize and process and produce the stories. We also used different editing techniques because some of them were in remote locations and some of them were in person because I was teaching a hybrid course. And we have some other things that we want to do that are still on the dockets because we're going to help them build a timeline and some other assets that they can use. This is one of our students right here. She was the team lead. She was the producer. This is the director. This is Kayla Jordan, and this is Earl Green. And they were part of a conversation that just happened this week on Tuesday to explain how they came about the information they did. And one short clip before I go.
Out of all of the chairpersons, there has only been one woman.
Dr. Livonia Allison, who was chair of the Durham Committee at the time I was being endorsed, by the time when I first got on.
And these are the types of things that we want to keep doing. The class itself is a service learning class. So this is very important for the students to really, it helped bridge the gap to them to get out into the community. So that's my time, and I thank you for listening. And if any of you have any suggestions, please put them in the chat room of other things that the students can add on to this project in the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Brett. Yeah, and it's very, really exciting to see the different pedagogical uses that you and Trudy and Vic and also the Polly Murray students have been sort of discussing here, presenting. Great. Okay, so I think next up is Alexandra Chasanoff from the NCCU Library School.
Just went ahead and shared a
chat, shared in the chat window some links for what I'm going to talk about. All right. Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Dr. Alex Chazanoff. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Library and Information Sciences at Central. And today I'm going to briefly introduce the Hacking into History project, which is a collaborative effort that is part digital history project, part crowdsourced transcription project, and an ongoing attempt to critically examine the role that exclusionary housing practices have played on the city of Durham and the makeup of different neighborhoods. So the project began in February of 2020, right before the pandemic hit. And it's a collaboration between Durham County, DataWorks, Central, and Research Action Design. And so the goal of our project initially was to hold public workshops to engage Durham community members with this practice of restrictive covenants. What are racially restrictive covenants, you may ask? So redlining in the last decade or so has become more widespread in terms of people understanding its history and knowing more about its impact. But the similarly widespread practice of racially restrictive covenants is not as well known. It's received significantly less attention. That's changing. Our project mirrors collaborative and ongoing efforts that are happening, particularly in Minneapolis, Hartford, Charlottesville, Seattle, and Washington, DC. And these projects are all affiliated, sometimes with library schools, sometimes not, but they're all aimed at bringing these collections of property deeds online and accessible for the public to engage with and to transcribe in some cases. And so racially restrictive covenants restrict the ways in which landowners may use their properties. They were explicitly added to property deeds to prevent non-whites from owning or residing or developing land in Durham County. But this form of segregation was of course practiced all over the country. And racially restrictive covenants became common after 1926. There was a US Supreme Court decision, Corrigan versus Buckley, which validated their use, and they were considered legally enforceable until 1948. However, while they're no longer legally enforceable, they still, these clauses still remain on a majority of covenant clauses unless you elect to have them removed in your property deed. So the presence of these deeds has been known by historians for some time, but similar to redlining, has increased awareness through digitization of these sorts of documents. And these are located in the Register of Deeds in printed out books. And so part of what our task has been is sort of contextualizing them in the context of bringing these to light through what we call process of excavation. We've built an online transcription component as a way of engaging community members through Zooniverse. And we hold public workshops and we ask our community to engage with the documents, to identify, review deeds, to look for the presence of these clauses, and then to transcribe them as a way of both kind of engaging people in the public as well as, verification of their presence in deeds. The ultimate end goal is to turn this legacy documentation, sometimes it's handwritten, sometimes it's typewritten, into machine readable and human interpretable corpuses. We have had to shift the focus of the project a little bit because of the pandemic. Initially, we were holding public workshops. We planned to hold public workshops in person, and that of course has switched to Zoom, but we've held 5 workshops since beginning in February of 2020.
Just some background and motivations for our work. If you live in Durham, you're aware that there is an ongoing gentrification crisis and housing crisis here. Several of us in the project were involved in previous efforts. The Bull City 150 exhibit was a public history project, and examining the history of housing and education in Durham. If you're familiar with Durham's history, you already know that Black Wall Street and the Hayti district were decimated with urban renewal, with the building of Highway 147. I was involved originally in the T-Races project a long time ago, which was my first exposure to digital humanities projects, but also I got the opportunity to witness how powerful archival documents and kind of the power of engaging with these sorts of historical records was really kind of through this exposure to the Southern Redlining Collection, which was a project back in 2009, 2010. And so just in terms of kind of thinking about the challenges and opportunities that we've had on this project, we've been thinking, of course, in terms of people, processes, and technology, because it is a digital history project that's ultimately part IT, part, how well our workflows are working for people to understand what we're trying to get them to do with tutorials. And then there's all sorts of intersection of these three kind of main areas. And so just briefly, we were really lucky that we had this group of experienced partners who are already doing data work, who've already been doing mapping, and also who already have existing community connections. We've enabled community facilitators to join our workshops, and that's been a really positive way of guiding people through the process of viewing these really difficult documents. From a technology perspective, the deeds were actually electronic but weren't OCR'd, and so we had to deal with that process as well. We don't have funding for this, and we're all very busy people who are all doing other things. So this is part of just what we've been continuing to build slowly, and we're excited to pursue a number of different opportunities in our future. This is just, I did put some of the links in the chat window, but this is an example of what we ask people to do in reviewing these deeds. We have used the Zooniverse platform, and then we have a tutorial. We ask you to review each deed to check for this language. If you find it, we ask you to transcribe it. Each deed takes about 2 to 3 minutes. Once you get used to that hang of it, it goes very quickly. But again, there's really context sensitive. These are really disturbing, especially for the first time that you see them, documents. And I'll just skip over this to talk about future work, because I'm really excited. We are, holding public workshops and engaging with different local groups. But thinking about kind of the larger picture here is, I'm always thinking regionally and nationally, of course, about what kinds of stories we can tell, especially in combination with other data sources. So of course, thinking about the Friends of Deer Cemetery project, that was a great introduction to a project that I was very curious about, and thinking about ways that we could combine our sources and our deeds that have property restrictions, burial plot restrictions on them. There's also some interest in pursuing legal courses of action, which is something that similar projects across the country have helped to spur into action, which would be to actually remove these clauses from all property deeds by state. And then part of what we're going to be working on locally is this a framework, which is something I've been thinking about since looking at the T-Races documents, in terms of the impact of historical data harms in the form of archival documents, and just sort of helping to prepare us as we move into this big data world of ways that we can also remember the human component of this work. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I'm really struck by this phrase, historical data harms, and I'd love to hear more if we have time to discuss anything, or but also for future conversation, just as a reminder to everyone that this need not be the be all end all of these conversations. I'm seeing so many different connections. Okay, so just in the interest of time, and I think our next speaker is Augustus Wendell, and unfortunately Davian Gabriel actually cannot join us, so I think it'll just be Augustus going solo.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to participate. It's been tremendously exciting to see the projects, and I'm eager to share with you a little lightning talk on a work that Davian and I are undertaking. My name is Augustus Wendell. I'm an assistant professor of the practice in the Department of Art History and Visual Studies here at Duke. And Davian is a MA student studying digital art history. And my specialization is centered around computational media and how media intersects with history and how media intersects with narratives as well. So I should also mention that I'm a relatively new transplant to Durham, so only 18 months at this point. And I think this project reflects my beginning to develop an understanding, or to probe an understanding of Durham and get a sense of what the history of this space and the city and the state is. I'd also like to say that I think in comparison to the projects that we've been seeing, this presentation is more about a portal or a platform than a project per se. So there's a problem, and the problem deals with occupied heritage physical geography. So when we go visit, when a user goes and visits a site, a historic site or an urban site that has history, that has heritage within it, there's an inherent limitation in what their knowledge of that site is, and they're limited to what they bring to the table, their understanding of history, their understanding of what has transpired in that place, and really importantly, at the nexus and origin of this project, the knowledge is often curated and shared by whoever owns the geography or whoever's in charge of telling the story of that geography. And this is especially important when we deal with contested geographies that have knowledge that isn't abundantly available to us through our visual sensation. So in contest with what the owner of the site is telling us, how are we as a user to understand the various histories? And this makes me think of this point that Andre brought up of moving from the idea of a single narrative to the much broader narrative. And really this project is about embracing in a broad way this narrative and the collection of narratives about physical geographies. And I think in this project, there's a sense of pushing back on the built environment as a monument and as the primary mechanism when we're occupying space to kind of propagate knowledge about that space. So our solution is to use the ubiquitous handheld device that so many of us have, the smartphone, as a portal into the history of a geography, and that could be a way to unlock this broader narrative, broader set of narratives, broader history of geographies. The benefit of these phones is that they're GPS enabled, so a phone knows where it is. It has some sense of its geographic location at all times, so we could use that to become self-aware about our location on a site. And applications could also use mobile networks to be serving data to the phone. So it can be very dynamic, and it can be a system that is changing. We can be adding more to the broader history of a site. We can be not limited to a single set, but this could be a project that continues to grow over time. And if we make our project, our app on our phone, very lightweight and dynamic, such that the app is only aware of where it is and is reaching out and asking questions elsewhere about the site, that it could be very lightweight and it could be very easy to install. There could be less of a barrier to getting someone to install this app when they go to a site. Traditionally, if you're visiting a site and you have a guidance app, you're going to need to make a decision about, do you have room? Are you willing to put in the time, the bandwidth to download that? Are you willing to commit to it? And this project is very much about making that commitment incredibly light and taking the heavy load of a traditional app that may provide information about geography, taking it off the phone and out into the cloud so it can be served very, very dynamically. And as I already mentioned, that the dynamism of this would allow that new content could be added, updated, refined, extended as narratives are found, as new constituencies are brought into telling stories and histories about spaces. The system can grow over time. As a case study, we use the historic sites of Durham, and this is where it becomes very personal to me, in that this was one of the set of sites that I visited and became very aware through my readings of those sites, and in particular in discussions with Vera Chichelski at the Stagville Plantation about kind of the nature of the history of that site and contested histories and the plural histories and voices that come to bear on that site. So what we're looking at here is a spreadsheet that translates these historic sites that we often think of as being physical locations that we occupy, and translates them into latitude and longitude coordinates. So it's coding the physical space into the language of geography that our phone and our GPS can understand. So we can have an application that's asking if we are within these latitude and longitudes. And that's all the app needs to know is what's the area of interest. And then when I enter that area of interest, then I can do something. And in the case of this portal, what happens is the app asks a server out on the web, I'm here at Bennett Memorial in Bennett Place. What histories are there? And the histories are then served to the phone. So it's not inherently placed into the app when the app is compiled. It doesn't have to be rebuilt over time, but those histories can be added into a server that is constantly pushing out to any phone that is asking for the various histories of the Bennett Memorial. And this is just a mock-up of the idea that when a user is on the site and using this portal, this app on a phone, this lightweight app that took very little time to install, wasn't much of a decision to make, that when they enter within a region around a memorial, or let's expand this maybe beyond our historic sites into an address in the city or a location of an old business that is no longer there. But when they enter into those coordinates, the phone understands. So in the case of this diagram, when we enter into that dome, the phone would become self-aware of, I'm close to an area of interest, reaches out and asks for all of the histories that are in the system about that area of interest. And in addition to reading the monument and hearing from the on-site historian, let's say, and speaking with your neighbors, you can get delivered to you histories, very plural histories that have been uploaded, reflections on this memorial, on this monument, and have your choice of how to navigate this plural, broader narrative of what that site means. And I want to conclude with just a few of the big thoughts that are really in the forefront of our thinking about this. And it's, who does our history belong to, especially in sites that have some power dynamic and an agency in place of propagating a single narrative about the history, and who speaks to our heritage and history, thinking that this, in an ideal world, will be a very public-facing data collection. And we're in the prototyping stage of the technology, not yet in the collection of histories. And what happens when we bring this history to the streets, and when, instead of being in front of a web browser or on a workstation looking at history, we are manifesting movement through space and through history at the same time? And what are the affordances when we combine these with broader, larger senses of pluralist history? That's it.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Augustus. Okay, so we are now at the final slot, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the event, Dr. Johnson can't join us today because unfortunately of a death in the family, but he sent along his a video presentation that he prepared about who speaks for history, whose history are we talking about, and how can the community be involved in telling its own story. So I'm just going to now share my screen and play the video that Charles prepared for us. Let me see.
Good morning. I'm Charles Denton Johnson, Assistant Professor of History and the Director of the Public History Program at North Carolina Central University. My introduction to digital history and the digital humanities began 2 decades ago at Howard University when I co-created a digital archive with Dr. Joseph E. Harris based on relations between African Americans and South Africans during the anti-apartheid period. We call that project the South African Research and Archival Project, or SARAP. Generous funding from the Andrew Mellon Foundation supported our work for more than a decade. Presently, my research and discussions engage current trends and issues that arise out of the rapidly transforming urban social spaces locally, and how best to preserve the history of those persons who are being displaced, i.e. African Americans. In my course as a public historian, I examine how public history can and does help empower communities that are fighting over contested living spaces to retain their historic and cultural identity. We examine, for instance, urban renewal and its impact, and where applicable, apply the lessons learned from that period to the present situation of African Americans living in urban spaces and historic African American communities in Durham. Historically, demographic shifts within urban spaces have often been accompanied by the slow but sometimes rapid erosion of old narratives of place. Durham residents currently face this challenge, where many former residents who established communities and who may have played a foundational role in the progressive upbuilding of the city are being replaced by outsiders who are unaware of the contributions of the former residents. These contributions are subject to being overwritten by new narratives of place and thus lost. This process can be very contentious and often hurtful from the vantage point of the former residents, who often feel unappreciated and ignored by political and government leaders, as well as new residents. Public historians can play a key role in interpreting and even mediating this process, and through a transparent and collaborative process, even help residents, old and new, to construct real community, one based on authentic relationships of empathy and understanding. So in short, my research interest is in how race and memory intersect with the past, and in understanding how the past, interpreted through oral histories, can inform our preservation of the history of rapidly gentrifying Black communities in Durham. Because Durham is rapidly changing and because many African American historic sites are being destroyed, we've chosen to use visual media and digital tools to help tell the story of Black Durham and to preserve its history. To that end, we're using Esri story maps and Google Earth to tell this story. In addition, we're creating an interactive website to bring our content together, museum exhibits, and more traditional publications also. Our sources have included oral histories, newspaper articles, and archival research. Our materials will be archived at North Carolina Central University. Although my interest is in all of Black Durham, including its business districts and burial spaces, for this lightning round, I'm sharing a slide deck on our work in the Bragtown community in Northern Durham County. Bragtown fits the model of a historically African American community that is rapidly gentrifying. These slides reflect some of the work in which we're engaged in Bragtown and are indicative of the work that we're doing across Black Durham and neighboring communities. Please note the collaborative nature of our work, and that in the case of Bragtown, the mural will be connected to an allied website via QR codes, quick response codes, where visitors can learn more about historic Bragtown. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of the work that we're doing in the public history program at North Carolina Central University.
Okay, so I think we're actually kind of proceeding to the wrap-up part of this, and we wanted to start with some closing thoughts from Andre, who's probably been at this longer and in a deeper way than many folks here. So I'll just turn things over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Christine. Well, first, I'm just thankful for all these stories. Let me just tell you, this be a Friday, a sunny, beautiful Friday, as I can sort of look out my window and see. But what better way than kind of end the week than to have these kind of thoughtful conversations, I think, sandwiched between all that is going on, taking place here in the city of Durham, in the midst of COVID-19 and racial unrest. But equally more important, I'm very, again, not just thankful for the stories, but also thankful for those that came before us. I think that's important. I'm reminded of a Hausa Nigerian proverb that states that lack of knowledge is darker than the night. And I think that really means that, opportunities like this present an opportunity for us to sort of grow and learn just a little bit more about this city, this place that we know as Durham. I do not come to this work lightly. I've been lucky and quite privileged over the years to work on a number of projects. Among the first that I engaged in began in grad school in 1994, 1995 here at North Carolina Central University, where I was among the first, not just in North Carolina, but also in the South, in a collaborative work between North Carolina Central University and Duke University with the Behind the Veil Project, where I was taught by the great and the late Leslie Brown, Annie Volk, Ray Gavins, and Beverly Washington Jones, which explored the history of Jim Crow South, and especially all throughout Durham. And that sort of gave me a much more greater and much more wide appreciation for the city of Durham. I have been here now, I should not say, but going on almost 32 years overall, as I came as a freshman to this city. And so understanding the complexities and the real stories is important to me. But also equally important is the idea, I think, of understanding that, when we talk about these presentations, we're talking about people, we're talking about the lifeblood, we're talking about the culture and context of this city and how we have gotten to where we are today. And so some of this history is what I would call easy history. But then there are parts of this history that's kind of what I would call tough history, which and these stories sometimes need to be told as well. A few other projects, I sort of focus on earlier as well that I should note is the most important, I think, in collaborative work that helps us understand how the humanities and also these collections at the neighboring institutions, how they all work. And that was a great project called Digitizing the Long Civil Rights Movement in North Carolina. That was a venture between North Carolina Central University, North Carolina State, UNC Chapel Hill, and Duke University as a way to sort of bring together this idea of digitizing and putting into the public realm many of our documents that spoke to this era of segregation and Jim Crow. And so that was important. I worked on the Gear Street project along with my colleagues, many of my colleagues here. But more importantly, I worked with the Rubenstein Library on a project with the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, understanding how we can bring these records from off the shelves into the public realm and into public display for others for consideration. All of that matters. All of that is highly important. But also, as I prepare, I'm moving on, understand that, when you talk about anything about Dr. John Hope Franklin, and I just want to thank the Humanities Institute, for your work in helping to sort of broach these conversations, bring them to the fore. Dr. Franklin was not just a mentor, but almost like an uncle and colleague and friend. And so I told folk I'm pleased to have a copy of every publication that he had ever produced. From Slavery to Freedom, which at first I must admit he didn't want to sign because he didn't have a copy himself, but I had one, but he signed it for me. And so I've been with him from the end when I arrived in '88 until he passed, and we prepared memorial service here on this campus. So I'm giving you the context of understanding that as we say here, the South is all about relationships, and if you don't understand that, you don't understand anything, right? So let me move ahead. What I like about this story is, first, many of these stories that are presented here, what I like is the fact that they cover the wide breadth and depth of Durham. That's important. And I always remind people, if you really want to understand Durham, you got to go to the farmer's market, right? And find your onion, right? And when you get that onion and you put that onion in your hand, you're just taking the kind of peel back those layers, right? And when you think, just when you think, you're peeling back, and just when you think you've gotten to the essence of what Durham is and all this history is, you will find that there's another layer there, and you might eventually one day get to the core But let me just tell you, easier said than done. All right. And so these are the stories that we have. And thank you all for opening up these very important discussions here on today. So I began also with the idea of reminding us that we sometimes have to learn. I don't care how learned we might be, that we have to learn to rethink how we see, and even more importantly, how we present history, and especially to the masses. I like the great question that was asked earlier about for whom are we engaging in this work, and for whom shall we make this available to? That's important. So even more importantly, it is the idea of understanding that, you know, when we take these manuscripts and materials and then move them to the digital world, then make them available to the public, that these are not just records and papers, right? These represent the lifeblood of the country and of the world, because these records and documents, even more importantly, are representative of the narratives, of the life stories of individuals, some known and some unknown. And so it's important for us to remember that. And so every now and then we are privileged, and understand this. We are privileged, first of all, even have a conversation about technology. I came from Vance County, a very rural area right up the road, and wonderful community that embraced me. I went back there and taught in the middle school, by the way, one year, used technology in this little town, unlike most of my colleagues, because I understood that sometimes it takes more than a book. It takes more than a person standing before you to sort of give you the historical facets that you need as an underpinning in this world. So that's important, right? But also equally more important, I think we can understand is the fact that, you know, the question of technology is a very privileged place and position to be in, for those who may not know again. And so I teach it when I teach a course here, historical research and methods. I've been the only one teaching it here for the last 13 years. And so I remind the students that as they think about going into the world, that they should always find ways to include these digital manuscripts and materials, hear the voices of people, use and infuse all of that in your teaching style. But equally more important for them, I ask them to make sure that they go and become advocates for the use of technology in their classroom. Also understanding that there are gaps in terms of where technology exists in this whole state of North Carolina, as great as I like to think that it is. But that's important, very important. So some of the themes here, looking at the organization, foundation of organizations, understanding that the impact of the landscape, most important as well, has been noted here, about understanding the impact of the environment. These are important questions along the way, but also looking at individuals. But equally more important is the role of technology in shaping in our daily lives the impact of this work and how it works in our lives daily. Also, even more importantly, I need not remind you in the midst and being reflective 1 year ago to where we are today, of understanding how in the midst of COVID-19, how conversations like this, not just a year ago, but even today, are important, right? But because these stories and narratives are important, and we are thankful for them. But also we understand that there are gaps in the narratives that we are able to see and show others. And so again, these stories become important, but it also asks us, as I noted earlier, for whom are we researching? And so, of course, we know of the scholarly community, the students. We know about local communities who are interested in this history as well, because we've heard bits and pieces of it already. But also let us consider sort of new ways of sort of taking this history to the people, right? By sharing with the community, in my opinion, estimation, its past, its history, and its stories. And many of you all have done that, and you have engaged that history as well. But also, I would encourage us to consider the idea of being willing to share more with the next generation. And what do I mean by that? I mean that I participated in a conversation, you know, at the end of Black History Month with the initiative, sort of looked at young persons and how you can find ways to infuse technology in that life. And so I would say, as I would say to you, that if you want students who are invested in their local community, who are engaged in local community, then give them more of this, give them more history, tell them more about their stories and more about their narratives. And most importantly, include them in the discussions about that which piece of history is being shared and that which is being discussed. I still say community pride matters. And I receive calls, just as been mentioned earlier, from public schools and students, and some students are so gifted they contact me themselves, and they want to know more about the history of not just Hayti and Black Wall Street, the history of North Carolina Central University, and they want to understand it and know it in different ways, right? And so again, you know, who are and for whom are we preparing and doing all this great research? That matters a great deal. But the stories are very complex and not sometimes so easy to tell, but that's important. And so I would just say that, you know, when we move from this idea, as noted earlier, of a one central character, one central narrative, I think we do a real disservice. And so it is good to hear and see others understanding and talk about that. I almost, as a historian, preach about it almost. Help people to understand that we have to broaden that narrative. We have to broaden those areas in which we look at in order to understand the complexity of these rich narratives and stories that exist in Durham, but we have only touched the surface, I hate to tell you. So there's more work to be done, and that needs to be done, especially around more inclusion about the stories of women, also more importantly about the underrepresented communities that we otherwise do not talk about, have not talked about. And so I've been privileged by living in Durham to sort of see some of this history sort of come alive and come well. And so I want to really commend my colleagues here for these great presentations that you have presented here. And I hope that we can make these much more widely known to others. As I close up, I don't want to get that look. But I say all that to say that, you know, when we look at this history, it is a privilege. And it's an honor to be able to sort of give back to those that which we have learned and know. And that's what knowledge is, the transmittance of what we know to others. And so as I close this presentation, I would like for you to consider that which you engage in as what I call, you know, I'm oftentimes called to interview individuals. And when I do, I always ask them one very important question, right? And I always ask them, well, what message in a bottle do you want to leave for the next generation? I want you to ask yourself that as well, as you think about the research that you're engaged in. And because I think these presentations represent a message in a bottle for the next generation to uncover and to really understand more about this city, this place that they know. And so last, I close with the words of James Joel, and he said it best. He said that the aim of the historian, like that of the artist, is to enlarge our picture of the world and to give us a new way of looking at things. And I think conversations presented here today offer us that great opportunity. And so I close with a great admonition to you to keep telling the stories, share them with others, and especially make sure you talk to the next generation, the young folk who need to know this history and culture. And I think we will have a much more responsive and helpful community going forward who are appreciative of this history and past. So anyway, I know I did not and could not cover everything in my talk, but I'll be glad to share with you a latter point. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone. No formal discussion now, but I just want to say on behalf of the DHI at FHI, we really appreciate your coming. It's been so inspiring, and all the messages that we got about ways of thinking through what we're doing, we'll carry them forward for sure. So thank you.